over the next hour, I'm going to be talking a little bit about composting, mostly focused on home composting methods, but a bit of other things as well. And I really like composting for a variety of reasons, but in particular, to me, it makes the entirety of the food cycle a loop. Because if we have the portion that we're growing food and then cooking and eating food, then we take the scraps, put them back in the soil, and it becomes the next part of the circle. So it's sort of the flip side of the harvesting vegetables and eating them is the composting so that you can grow again next year. So I'm going to be sharing my screen so that I can show you a PowerPoint. And I'm mostly going to be relying on the PowerPoint for this. Although occasionally I will stop sharing my screen and I will take my camera and I'm going to be pointing it here at my desk where I have some examples to show. And then at the end, we'll make sure to answer every question that has come up. So, all right, I will, without further ado, I will share my screen. There we go. So can everybody see a slide that says composting? Good, yes, just making sure. The mysteries of technology, sometimes you need to check. All right, so the absolute basics, of course, just starting with a definition, compost is when we are taking food scraps and plants and helping them rot back into soil. The most common form that people tend to do at home and what pops into their brain when they think about composting is a compost bin, which is just any kind of a sturdy enclosure made out of non-toxic material that is used to just keep things neat and tidy while they are breaking down. It's also common, especially if you're living on an acreage or a farm or somewhere with a little more space, that you may just have a heap. There are ways to compost outside of a heap or bin as well. There are things like a trench compost, which involves burying materials. And there are even some really nifty methods that are good for small spaces or indoor spaces like vermicomposting, which is done in a small tub, or bokashi composting, which starts in a sealed 5-gallon pail. But bin composting is by far the most common one that you would find around here. Okay, so physically what's actually happening in the compost is that microbes are doing most of the work. So we have a variety of beneficial funguses and beneficial bacteria and some other creatures as well that are eating and digesting the food scraps and plants. And while they are doing that, they transform the molecules into different ones. So basically they are switching up all of the plant material back into soil material while they are feeding. The things that are larger than microbes includes some things that are still too small to see without a microscope, like nematodes, but it also includes stuff we can see with the naked eye, like these little guys here on the right, which are springtails, or you may be familiar on the left with some people call them cell bugs, some people call them roly-polies, some people call them wood lice. They have many names, but they're very good at helping to break down leaves and wood. And then, of course, most of us will be familiar with the earthworm, which is present in most soils around the world, although not all of them. There are a variety of northern biomes, including parts of northern Saskatchewan, where earthworms are actually not native because they died off during the last ice age. But down in the grasslands and everywhere further south, you would expect to find earthworms whenever your soil was rich and had lots of organic matter in it. And these ones are also very helpful in a compost bin for helping to break things down. I'm going to talk a little bit now about why would we choose to compost? Basically, what's the point? Is there any benefit rather than just putting all of our materials into the trash can instead? So there's 4 main things that we tend to talk about. The first one is really simple, and it's just that we make less garbage if we are not putting all of our food waste into it. The second one is a little bit less well understood by many parts of the population, and it actually is that things don't rot the same under all circumstances. And it turns out that things rot fairly differently in a landfill than they do in a compost system. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. From the gardener and the farmer side of things, this is very near and dear to my own heart. We compost so that we can create a substance that helps us build healthier soil and grow healthier plants. And the last thing is, if we're dealing with soils that have been quite degraded, places where due to either weather or human treatment, the soil has kind of become fairly dead and unhelpful and unfertile over time, we can actually rebuild that soil again by starting with some compost. Okay, so to do with it making less garbage, just a little bit more detail on that. This graphic on the left, this is from the city of Saskatoon back in 2016, and they were doing a waste survey to see what was being thrown away because they wanted to basically figure out how to extend the life of the landfill. And this is the graphic that they have that's for a regular old single family household, so a group of people in a house who are not composting at home. And they found of what they were throwing away, over half of it was actually organic material, that is to say, food waste and plant waste that could have been going into a compost instead. So obviously, if they're going to take that portion out, this family would have less than half as much garbage, which would make a huge difference to the city. The numbers aren't exactly the same for people in apartments or for industry, but they did find across the board, every sector had a significant chunk that was just organic waste. And when all of this goes to the landfill, it causes a lot of expense because, and this is the kind of unfortunate thing, it turns out that dealing with garbage is just very expensive. It costs a lot of money for municipalities, whether you're a large city with a landfill, whether you're a smaller place and you just have a transfer station. Just dealing with our solid waste and getting it where it needs to go and making sure that it's disposed of safely is kind of expensive. So the less garbage we make, the less money has to be spent on it, and the more money is freed up for other kinds of civic services and projects. All right. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the way things rot differently in different places. So I mentioned a landfill doesn't act the same as a compost bin, and this is something that a lot of people just don't actually know. So there are a variety of kinds of microbes in the world. Of course, there's millions of kinds of microbes in the world, but they fall into two general categories. Ones that need to breathe oxygen from the air, which we call aerobic microbes, and ones that don't, ones that can get along fine with no fresh air at all. And those are called anaerobic microbes. In a compost bin, we want to be encouraging the ones that breathe air because they break things down pretty fast and clean, and they don't make a lot of mess. However, when you don't have a lot of fresh air, you end up mostly with anaerobic microbes. And that's what happens when we're in a landfill. Everything is packed down super tightly and then covered up with much, much more material. And so there's no access to air. And because of this, only anaerobic microbes can live there. And they break things down very slowly. It can take years or decades for things to degrade. And they also, at the same time, they make a lot of byproducts, ones that we're not really looking for. They make things like methane gas, which is a greenhouse gas and an air pollutant. They make things like ammonia, which can get into the water table and potentially cause problems in the lakes and rivers around the landfill. And in general, it's a nuisance and it's a pollution source. So if we're able to keep that organic material out of the landfill and have the landfill just be for stuff that's not degrading, like plastic and glass and metal, then we don't get all of that pollution forming there. And at the same time, we don't get it in the compost either, because when we are making sure that there's lots of fresh air in a compost system, we encourage the aerobic microbes, and in turn, they break things down fast. Then they don't make all that methane and ammonia. They give off just a little bit of carbon dioxide, which, while a greenhouse gas is just a natural part of things breaking down and kind of unavoidable, but they're not making any of that methane and they're not making any of that ammonia, and they break things down quickly. So rather than decades, it'll take a few months. And so this is the way that we want to do things. It's much easier to process this kind of waste when it's separate from the rest of the glass and the plastic and the junk. Oh yeah, so this is a slide explaining what I just said, that everything in the compost bin needs some air. Okay, next, for the gardener, for the home gardener or the large scale farmer or anybody who is raising plants and food, it's important to understand the way compost and organic matter in general improves the soil. So the fluffy material that's made out of formerly living plants and animals that we find in soil does a whole lot of very important things. One is it's a huge source of nutrients, of food for the plants. And it's all tied up in fairly stable molecules. So the nice thing is that it's actually not all available at once. It doesn't overwhelm the plant with all of the food at once. It lets it go a little bit at a time. So you can put on compost in your garden 1 year, and it will continue to feed the plants for 5 or 10 years. Whereas if you're using something water soluble, like a Miracle-Gro or any kind of a dissolving powder, that gives a quick, fast, intense shot of energy to the plants, but it doesn't stick around very long. Whereas compost keeps going for a long time. It also helps with texture. If we have really dense, heavy clay soil, as some parts of Saskatchewan have, the fluffy material in compost helps to loosen it and to start to let more air and water get into it, so it's not so dense. On the flip side, if we have very loose, coarse, sandy soil, which also some parts of Saskatchewan have, which normally dries out too fast and blows away, the material of the compost will help start binding little bits of that soil together to make it a little bit more cohesive, and it doesn't erode as quickly, and it holds on to more water as well. So it both improves texture, it's got tons of plant food in it, and the last one is that it improves the way the soil hangs onto water, soaks up and hangs onto water. So all of that organic matter, again, acts like a sponge, like a reservoir. And when water is added, either through irrigation or from the rain, it soaks it all up so it can hang on to much more, and you don't get as much ponding and flooding on top of the water. And then it stays wet for longer, so it doesn't dry out as quickly in between the rain or irrigation. So for that reason, compost can help gardens and agricultural land be more resilient, both to droughts and to floods, which is really nice that it's able to do both at once. So these are the actual reasons that we're putting it on the garden. It helps in a lot of ways to make our soil healthy and to let us grow plants that are not only robust and strong, but also resilient to diseases, and that can noticeably grow produce, vegetables and fruits that are larger and have more nutrients in them because there's more for them to draw from in the soil. Yes, this is this is saying what I just said. That it's full of nutrients. It makes the soil more crumbly and it supports the soil's ecosystem. I will also say I like this picture for the reason that it shows, it demonstrates something that everything in the squash family does specifically. So that's all of our pumpkins and our acorn squash and our zucchinis and everything in the squash family are quite interesting and unique in that they don't even wait for the compost to be finished. They will happily grow right out of the compost bin. And if you're ever making some pumpkin pie or a jack-o'-lantern and you scoop the seeds and they go out into the compost, there's a good chance next year you may get some volunteer pumpkin plants just sprawling out of your compost. If you don't want them, you can always pull them up, but I think it is just nice to have free plants. Anyway, so the last thing I'm going to talk about for benefits before we get into the actual methods of what we're doing at home is that compost can be used to restore degraded soil. There have been some very, very interesting scientific studies done over the last 25 years looking at the effect of adding a half-inch layer of compost onto degraded rangeland or other kinds of degraded soil. So that's places where the soil has been used very hard for a long time and it doesn't have much nutrients or fertility left. And they found that adding compost into the soil not only started improving the fertility, but it kicked off a very interesting biological cycle where the soil was drawing more and more carbon dioxide out of the air and storing it as soil carbon. So it was not only restoring the fertility of the piece of land and making it useful for agriculture again, it was also actually a measurable mitigation of climate change by sequestering more carbon. I'm not going to get into this in detail, both because I'm not the big expert on it and also because it could be a whole evening on its own. But if you're ever interested in learning more about this, of restoration and carbon sequestration through the use of compost, look up carbon farming, because this is what it's typically called, carbon farming. It's very interesting. But I will move right along. I apologize for the sidebar there. I am the daughter of an organic farmer, and sometimes when people talk about farming, I get very excited still because I'm a big nerd about soil. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about the actual options and methods for composting. Some of these will be specific to Saskatoon, but many of them will be applicable wherever you are. So I'm just going to mention, first of all, if you do live in or around Saskatoon, in Saskatchewan, we have 2 compost depots, which are places that people can drop off yard waste like leaves, grass, trees, branches in the summer, the spring, summer, or fall. They're open from the month of May until November. They are not open over the winter because they are outdoors, and when they get snowed on, they are done for the season. But it is free to use to drop things off, and then the city takes and shreds and blends the material and turns it into compost, the finished compost, I should say. The finished compost they have there is then used in city parks. It's used by Saskatoon community gardens. And if you go to the compost depot on the west side of town, this is the one that is on Highway 7, where it intersects with 11th Street, they actually have a pile of finished good compost that folks can take home for free. So if you show up with a bag of leaves and you take a couple of buckets, you can fill them up with compost and bring it home to your garden or your community garden or a friend or anywhere that could use it, which is very nice. Again, this is only from May to November, and all of the information about where they are, what they accept, when they're open can be found on the city website. All you would have to look for is Saskatoon Compost Depot, and all of the information will come up. Another option in Saskatoon, and many other cities as well have options like these available, but another option in Saskatoon is that we do have a green cart program. Right now, this is optional, and it is an opt-in program. So if folks who live in a household that have the blue bin and the black bin, blue bin for recycling, black bin for garbage, would like to also have a green bin, which is only for food waste and yard waste, they can contact the city, pay, I believe it is, if you register before the end of April, it's $65. If you register after the end of April, it's $85, and that's for 1 year of service. They will bring you this green cart, and they will empty it every 2 weeks. They will take it away to make it into finished compost. Some people do this so that they can make sure that their materials aren't going to the landfill, they're not going to make a lot of pollution, but maybe they don't have the space or the time or even the energy to be doing composting themselves. So they will send it away to the city. At the moment, this is limited in that it's not available to folks living in apartments or other places with communal dumpsters rather than the individual bins. And it's also not currently available in the winter. It's just from May to November. But they are thinking about expanding the program and making it both available to everyone and available all year in the future. That's just, it's a project for a later day. We are not sure yet when it's going to happen. But now I'm going to talk about the third option, which is my favorite, which is just doing it yourself because it's easy. And then you don't have to mess around with fees. You don't have to mess around with driving stuff anywhere. You can just pick a corner of your yard, or even if you're in an apartment, have a little indoor bin and you can do it yourself. Very often when people compost, they might be using a bin like this that is something made of plastic bought from a store. These are fine as well. Again, the bin for a compost bin is really just a sturdy container to hold things. It isn't what makes the composting happen, and you don't need to get a really fancy one for it to work. It's just to keep stuff neat while it's breaking down. At the beginning, I talked about how composting is all about microbes, fungus and bacteria, eating the materials and changing them from plant tissues and stuff back into soil. So when we're trying to compost at home, if we want it to happen quickly, and if we want it to happen with no smells or pest problems, what we want to do is to create just the right mix so that the microbes we like can multiply, thrive, and get to work. To be clear, compost will always work eventually. In nature, of course, no one goes around scooping up all of the leaves from the forest, putting them into a compost bin, stirring them a lot, and then putting them back in the forest. It does it itself. The only reason that we kind of follow a particular recipe when we're doing it at home is we want it to happen fast. We want it to happen without any bad smells. And we want it to happen without attracting any animals or other pests. So that's why we have a recipe, but anything will work eventually. Okay. Don't worry too much about the small writing here. The big green writing is the important part. This is the basic recipe for home composting that happens quickly and without any troubles. So we add some air, we add some water, we add a little bit of regular old soil, and then we have something called green and brown materials, which I'm going to talk about in some detail. Okay, first, this is the most complicated one. So if this one is a bit overwhelming, don't worry, they are all much simpler after this one. I will talk about green materials. Green materials are, well, if we were speaking chemically, green materials are things that are high in nitrogen. But of course, it's hard to tell just by glancing at a thing what the chemicals making it up are. More specifically, green materials are things that were kind of fresh. They're things that break down and rot quickly. They're often quite soft or they have a lot of moisture. So it's all of, it's food waste, it's green plants, it's green grass clippings. And if we were in a country setting, it might include livestock manure, maybe. And these are the things that really help the microbes get going. They're the fuel that feeds the compost and helps it to break down. But if we have a pile that is all this stuff, it's just banana peels or it's just green grass clippings, it tends to be a little bit too wet and dense, and it gets a bit smelly. It can smell a bit well, it has an ammonia smell. It's difficult to describe, but on its own, it's not very well balanced. And so we would want to put in more than just this. I'm going to come back to talk a little bit more about green materials in a second, but first I'm going to tell you how to balance it. We would always be wanting to balance our green materials, which is our fresh stuff that rots quickly, with some brown materials. These are things that are high in carbon rather than nitrogen. And basically it's stuff that's more dead and weathered and woody. So it can include dead plant material like brown leaves, brown vines, fall leaves, straw. It can include wood products like sawdust or wood chips or post peelings or little sticks, just anything made out of wood. And it can also, a really good one to put in is paper products. So things like dirty cardboard from a pizza box or takeout containers, or newspapers or flyers that come in the mail, or napkins if you've eaten something delicious and then wiped your hands with a paper napkin and now it's too dirty to be recycled. Well, it could very easily go into the compost and be a useful brown material. Ideally, in a compost bin, to keep it all working really, really well, we want about, and it's very approximate. Do not worry too much about being exact because it's not an exact recipe, but we want it to be about half this dry, woody brown material and about half this soft, fresh green material. And when we have approximately half and half, it works much better than if it's mostly greens or if it's mostly browns. I mentioned the problem with all greens is that it tends to become dense and wet and smelly. The problem with all browns is that it takes far too long to break down. This is missing the fuel that gets the compost going. So this stuff just kind of sits and sits and sits and sits, and maybe in 10 years it'll be compost, but it won't be compost in a few months. So we need to mix it up with the green stuff. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about more specifics of green materials, and I'm actually going to turn off my PowerPoint for a second so that I can show some examples that I have here on my desk. So just give me a minute to do a little transition. I'm juggling slightly too many things. Here we go. Stop the screen share so it's back to me. Okay, now you can see my camera and I'm going to point it down at my desk. There we go. Okay, so green material will include plants from outside. If you have an outdoor space, if you garden, if you have any grass or trees. So it will include things like green grass clippings, if you have them, if you have a lawn, if it gets mowed, if you pick up the clippings. There's a lot of if statements there. It will include green garden plants, and it will include green weeds that have been pulled. There's a couple of little exceptions there though. One is if you have a garden plant that has died of some kind of serious plant disease, Like if you had a tomato patch, but this year it was wiped out by blight, everything turned black and slimy and died, you wouldn't want to put that in the compost because you might accidentally have compost in the end that has the blight disease in it and it could get spread by that compost. So if you have a plant that has died of a very obvious disease, that plant should probably go in either a burning barrel or the garbage instead. But all of the other plants, anything that hasn't obviously died of disease is fine. When it comes to weeds, some people choose to make sure that weeds that have gone to seed, like a thistle that has a big fluffy seed head on it, also stay out. Some people don't worry about it and they just put it in. That's really up to your own level of care when it comes to avoiding weed seeds. I tend to be fairly laissez-faire and throw everything in. I've also known people who are very careful, and if there are any seeds at all, it doesn't go in. It is absolutely your own personal preference and how careful you're being. So that's for outside, any green material, grass clippings, green plants. When we're talking about inside, which especially this time of year is what we're primarily concerned with, we're talking about food waste. So as I go about my day and I'm preparing food and eating food, there are a variety of little scraps and things that I could be setting aside to go into the compost instead of tossing them in the trash. The primary things is anything that comes from vegetables or fruits. So here, you know, of course, I've got, if I had myself an apple as a snack, I usually have the core left over, and this is part of a fruit, so it would be very good to go into the compost. Similarly, I might have trimmed the top off of a carrot for soup, and the tops of this could go straight into the compost. If I've peeled some of the carrots or the beets or anything else that I'm using, then the peels could be set aside. If I've had myself a little banana later in the day, then of course the peel is a piece that could go into the compost. So anything that comes from a vegetable or a fruit, it can even be, say you have a bag of apples and something came up, you forgot about them for too long, and those apples went bad. All apples were moldy and squishy, could not be eaten anymore. The whole bag of apples, well, take the plastic bag out, of course, but the whole portion of apples could go straight into the compost. It's fine if things are already rotten or moldy. That's just a sign that they are already starting to decompose. They will not harm the compost. In fact, they've kind of got a head start. Other things that can go in, well, I mentioned there are things that have started to go bad that we don't want to eat because they've started to go bad can certainly go in. So if I had here a little bit of lettuce that it's hard to see on camera, but that might have been forgotten just a bit too long in the fridge and it's a bit slimy now, this would go into the compost instead of into my lunch. Perhaps I have some onion skins here. Not similarly, an extra thing, if you're ever making any sort of a plant-based drink like tea or coffee, then you will end up with some food waste that could go into the compost. So when it comes to tea bags, generally we can put the whole thing in. They are usually made with paper. You can tell because it can tear, so it will break down as well. And so I would just take the whole thing and that would go in the compost. The occasional brand of tea bags, and you'll see it if you go to tear it and it won't tear, have plastic for their bag. They don't compost as well. But the worst case scenario is that you'd have to take a little bit of plastic out of your compost at the end when it is soil. It's also not really going to harm anything. And then, of course, if we're making coffee, then we have our coffee grounds and our paper filter, and this whole thing could go right into the compost. Still plant-based, but a little bit less obvious, things that are made with flour and seeds can go in the compost. So if I have a heel of bread that's gotten old and stale, maybe it's got a little mold on it, not safe to eat anymore, this could also be composted, as could something like stale pasta or rice or oatmeal, unless I had cooked it in something that gave it a lot of grease. Like if this bread was soaked in eggs or mayonnaise or peanut butter or something like that, then I might leave it out, and I'll talk about why. The last thing that I'm going to mention as being very useful for the compost is eggshells. These are very interesting in that you may see they're kind of the odd one out here. They're not a plant material, they're an animal material. And also, they don't really rot the same way as everything else. All of these things will completely disintegrate into black crumbly soil and we won't see them at the end. But the eggshells, they tend to just stay as little bits of eggshell in the finished compost. And that's because they almost act more like tiny pieces of rock than like pieces of plants. And they dissolve very slowly through rain and erosion, but they are still very, very good for the soil. They are a strong source of calcium, which is especially important when we're growing vegetables, which need a lot of calcium in the soil. Things like tomatoes can really appreciate eggshells. So these are the good things that we would want to put in. The things we want to avoid, because there are some of those as well. The rule of thumb is anything that has a lot of grease or protein is not great to go into the compost. I actually don't have examples of that here, unfortunately, but the sort of things that I would talk about would be the bones from a chicken or fish spines, the inside of the egg, the actual liquid portion of the egg, or things made out of milk like cheese and yogurt and butter. But also a few things made out of plant materials if they are quite greasy. So things like cooking oil or peanut butter. Anything that has a lot of grease or a lot of protein is not a great idea to put in a home compost. And there's a couple of reasons for that. It's actually not that they won't break down, because they will. They will eventually rot back into soil. However, it takes a little bit longer, and this is the important part, while they are breaking down, things with a lot of grease and protein in them, like bones and meat, they have a very powerful bad smell, and we don't like it. It bothers humans because it's the kind of smell that makes us think of, well, roadkill or something being dead. So we have a fairly instinctive about that smell, and we don't like it. The second thing is that while the humans don't like it, the animals do. So it is the kind of smell that can bring anything from a little mouse to a squirrel or a skunk or a raccoon or a coyote, or if you're far enough north, a bear. Well, bears are different. Bears can smell half an ounce of toothpaste 5 miles away. But other things, like coyotes and mice and stuff, it makes a huge difference to keep the greasy stuff or the meaty stuff out of the compost. So when we are cooking throughout the day, maybe we'll have a container that we put our materials in. It's very common. This is the one I see the most often when we're doing home visits for people, that somebody will just use a little ice cream bucket. And on their counter next to their sink or under their sink, they'll have a little ice cream bucket with a lid. And as they're cooking throughout the day, they'll just occasionally pull it out and throw in their coffee grounds and their banana peels and their carrot peels, and then they'll pop the lid back on and they'll put it back under the sink. And when it is full, or, well, I should say generally when it is full, but if you want to do best practices, every couple of days before it has time to get stinky, you take it outside to the compost bin and you empty it out. And that would be how they would deal with it in their house. Plastic is very common because it's cheap and easy. You can use almost anything. I sometimes prefer to try to put something in metal, like a bowl or a metal bucket. And the reason is just that these ones don't hang on to smells the way plastic does. However, you could use either, and if eventually somewhere down the line your plastic bucket test starts to get just a little stinky, you might recycle it and get a new one. Gives you an excuse to buy more ice cream. No, don't take that advice from me. If you want, a thing you can do that makes your home container for catching things more hygienic is the wrong word, convenient to use, is you might line the container with something. You do not have to, but if you do, things will dump out easier and the container itself will stay cleaner, so it won't need to be rinsed or washed as much. Some stores sell rolls of compostable plastic bags. They're often green in color, and many people like to use them to line their home containers, and I don't blame them for that, but I have a warning. Pretty much all of the compostable plastics that are on the market right now only break down properly in large industrial compost systems. They're very hard to break down in home compost systems because our little home bins don't get hot enough for long enough to really degrade the plastic. So if you buy the little bread bags that are green and say compostable on them, and you put them in your home compost bin, chances are really good when you go to actually get the compost out that you will still find shreds of those little bags all through the compost. So I would recommend skipping them entirely. Personally, I wish that they were marketed more carefully because I feel like at the moment they're trying to trick people into buying them without being honest about what it takes to get them to break down. But that's my own personal pet peeve. Much better, I think, for lining things is to use paper. Some kind of scrap paper, if you have any around, a piece of a paper towel, a piece of a flyer, a paper bag, a paper bag from some takeout food. If you get a newspaper of any kind, newspaper is perfect. I know very few people actually get the newspaper at home these days. I still do because I am secretly 80 years old. No, that's not true. But so you just take your paper and cram it down in your container, and then you would add stuff on top, and when it goes to dump it out, the whole thing will come out clean because the bucket and the paper will just go separate ways. So that's a really nice way to do it. When it comes to flyers and other scrap paper and stuff, it actually doesn't matter if it has colored ink on it. Back in the 90s and 80s, they used to tell people if your newspaper has colored ink on it, don't put it in the compost, because it used to have some scarier stuff in the colored ink. It doesn't now. It's safe to use. You don't have to worry about that anymore, which is very nice. Okay, so that's my little aside about gathering things from the kitchen. When I mentioned about trying to take it out every 2 or 3 days rather than always waiting for it to be full is really helpful, but I will admit that it's advice that I fail to actually follow a lot of the time, and where I'll just keep cramming stuff into my little compost bin in the kitchen until it's really full and kind of stinky when I finally convince myself, okay, it's time to go take it out to the compost bin outside. But you will have a better time of it if you do take it out more often. So basically, take me as a negative example. Don't do what I do. I also realized I missed one final example of the type of things that you might be putting in your compost from the kitchen. And that's if you have some old spice mixes, the last bit of the spice mix in there, and it's who knows how many years old, and when you smell it, it doesn't smell like anything. It smells like dust. It has no flavor left. To get old spice mixes that don't have any flavor anymore and help to grow something new in the garden next year. So those are the kinds of food waste things that we would want to get from inside. I guess the most interesting and strangest thing that I put into my compost lately was we had a whole large jar of iced tea powder that we had forgotten in the back of a cupboard, and it was many years old, and it smelled very strange, and we did not want to make iced tea out of it anymore. So the whole container, which was basically just sugar, went straight into the compost bin. And I know that will break down very well because it doesn't have protein, it doesn't have fat, it's just got sugar. So it's going to break down fine in that compost bin in the spring. The last thing I'll say here is just an example of brown materials again. So if we have access to stuff outside and the fall, we can always store up some leaves or sticks or other brown materials if they are around. Pine needles can be used as well, and pine cones. They don't work quite as well. Leaves are better, but you use what you have available. And on that note, soiled paper is a great source of browns for the compost as well. So things like your napkins, your muffin liners, your paper, your toilet paper tubes, your popsicle sticks and toothpicks, but basically all of the paper stuff that comes out of a kitchen is very good for going into the compost. Okay, going to put all of that aside. Thank you for your patience, and go back to the PowerPoint. There we go. Okay, so to sum all of that, the fresh stuff is the green material, the old woody stuff is the brown material, and we want to have about half of each. The nice thing about brown material is you can store it up for a long time until you need it, because it doesn't break down very quickly on its own, so it doesn't get stinky or anything. So you can have a bag of leaves sat beside your compost bin to add some when you need some, and you can have it there for a couple of years and it would be fine. But you can't store up a bag of banana skins for 2 years without it getting very nasty. So we generally add the greens as we need them. Add the greens right away and add the browns as we need them. Okay, so the other 3 things, they're all miles simpler than those 2. The first one is that we can add a little bit of soil or previously finished compost. We don't need a ton, a few handfuls or half a shovelful. Maybe we'll add it every 2 weeks or every 2 months or once a summer. There's really no exact recipe for this part, just a touch of regular old soil. And the reason we do this is that soil is full of decomposition microbes and it helps to get the process going. The thing that we usually talk about is that it's very much like adding some yeast into bread dough. And the second thing is that it's another thing that helps to prevent any bad odors. So just a little bit of soil. It's actually optional. You can go with no soil and still have a good compost, but it really does help things to work properly. The next one, I don't know why I put this in as number 4. This is the most important one. In the prairie climate specifically, this is the one that's missing most often, and the one that people seem to, the one that makes the most difference when we tell people about it. Compost has to be wet. If it's not damp, it actually just stops breaking down. It goes into hibernation. And so if you fill up your compost bin right full of stuff, and you don't water it, and we have a few hot, sunny weeks in the summer and it gets completely bone dry in there, it's just going to sit there. It's not going to do anything for years. So you want to add enough water to keep things damp. You don't have to do this like you would with plants. You don't have to go out and water your compost every day because it's not a plant. It doesn't matter if it gets wilted. But you might want to do it in the summertime every couple of weeks, just to make sure that things are still trundling along and moving towards being soil. When people start regularly adding water to their compost when they haven't before, they're usually pretty amazed by the difference it makes in the decomposition. The last one that I'm going to talk about is air. We've already touched on this one a little bit, in that this is what makes things different in a compost versus a landfill situation. But how do we actually keep air in a compost bin? So if you have a heap, it's already getting tons of air around the edges. Most compost bins also have some little vents or gaps around the edges to let in air. So basically the outer edges of the compost are pretty well always going to have enough air. The only thing we ever have to think about or worry about is the middle of the pile, right in the middle, where it can get a little short on air if we don't do anything. The first thing that we might do, not first thing, sorry, it's not in an order. One thing we might do is we could put in an aeration pipe, which is to say we might get a little piece of plastic pipe, either from a hardware store or left over from some kitchen reno, and we'll drill some holes into it. So now it's a perforated pipe. And we would put that in the center of our compost pile with the end sticking out, basically like a big straw. And the large straw would just allow air to filter directly into the center of the pile, which allows it to get lots of fresh air. And that works really well. The second thing that we could do is that we could use some kind of a stirring tool, like either a potato fork or a shovel, or you might shell out a little extra money to get an actual compost aerator, a tool dedicated specifically to stirring up compost, like this thing here, the third one in. And you might stir your compost every couple of weeks or every month or every couple of months, or even just once or twice a season. Any of those can be okay. And that'll make sure of a couple of things. It'll both make sure that there's tons of fresh air in the pile, and also it'll break up any clumps that are in there and help them to mix in better. So of all of these methods, stirring things helps things to break down the quickest with the fewest lumps. But anything that helps air get into the pile is fine. And even if you don't do any interventions, no pipes, no stirring, no nothing, eventually it will break down. It'll just be the bottleneck, that what's holding it up will be the lack of oxygen at the center of the pile. The second thing is, if piles never get stirred, that is another time where sometimes we will notice a little bit of a bad smell, because the lack of oxygen means those frustrating anaerobic microbes are getting in there again, and they're the ones that make methane and all the stinky stuff. One last thing that I will say, actually, no, wait, I have a slide on that later. So I will come back to it. I'm extremely organized tonight, I hope you can tell. All right, anyway, a couple of other things that affect how fast the compost breaks down. One, particle size. Small things that are chopped up break down faster than big chunks of stuff. So it's the difference between trying to compost a log and some sawdust. Or more specifically, if you're putting in big tomato vines or potato vines, you might want to maybe step on them and crunch them up a little, or rip them into some pieces first. A second thing is the size of the actual pile. It turns out that really large piles of compost break down a lot faster than small ones. This is because they don't get dried out as fast, they have more food for the microbes, and they hold more heat. And the last thing is that if you really want to make compost really fast, you're in a big hurry, you need some finished compost, yesterday, you're in a huge hurry, then what you should do is you should get a whole bunch of material at once and put it all together at once. Get 3 bags of grass clippings, get 3 bags of leaves, stir them all together, and that'll break down much faster than if you're adding a half a bucket of leaves and a half a bucket of grass clippings every couple of days for a month. It's just when there's lots of fresh material available, then the microbes can really multiply and really go nuts. So those are just, if you're in a big hurry, these are tips you can do to make your compost happen faster and hotter, which is a thing I will mention here. So the kind of microbes we like, those aerobic microbes that breathe oxygen, when they're really active, they generate heat. It's just from their metabolism. It doesn't, in a little home compost bin, you will often not really notice this happening because in little piles, they don't hold enough heat for it to be really obvious. When we have larger compost piles, like a big meter cube like these or the big industrial systems, you will sometimes be able to notice, oh, it's really warm in there in that compost, especially if you've just turned it and some steam is coming off of it or something like that. Because large active piles of compost can actually get up to 50 or 60 or even 70 degrees Celsius in the middle, which is quite hot indeed. They don't tend to get up beyond that because A, people running the compost in industrial factories are watching for it because it is a danger, and B, if they get above about 75 degrees, they might start on fire, which generally doesn't happen, but it is something that people with very large compost systems are watching for. And if they're getting to that sort of danger range, they pour a bunch of water on it to cool it down. This is just a neat thing. Your compost doesn't have to get hot to break down, and home composts usually just sort of trundle along at regular old cool temperatures. But if your compost does get hot, specifically, if you make a compost pile that gets up to 55 degrees Celsius for 48 hours, that's enough to kill basically all weed seeds and any pathogens that got in there. So if you're able to get stuff that hot, then you can safely compost things like dog waste and other pathogen-laced things that are normally not safe to put in the compost because you'll sterilize them, basically. But this isn't what most people are doing at home, and that's fine. We don't really need to be aiming for it unless it's our preference. Okay, avoiding animals. And I swear, I'm very close to the end of my PowerPoint, I promise. We'll be doing questions in just a second. So I have the picture here of the bear to be a bit of a joke in that if you are up north, bears around garbage and compost and even recycling are a problem. But most of us are not dealing with bears. Most of us are dealing with skunks or raccoons or mice. And in fact, in Saskatchewan, we're basically just dealing with mice. So the biggest thing to keeping mice out of a compost is to keep it wet and keep it stirred. Because what they're really looking for is they're looking for shelter. They're looking for a safe place to hide. And if we keep things stirred and wet, then it feels like an unsafe place that is also an uncomfortable place. And we basically never see the mice in there, especially if we're not adding any greasy or meaty material. Nothing is guaranteed. Of course, if you're living somewhere where there's a big rodent infestation, then who knows? But in general, in all of our years of doing home visits to people around Saskatoon, we have only ever seen a mouse a couple of times, and it was only in bins that were bone dry and hadn't been touched for years because they're a safe place for them to hide. So yeah, stir it and water it, and you won't have mice. Although if you you don't have time to water it, you don't have time to stir it, and you're very scared of mice or something like this, what you might want to do in the first place is get a compost bin that's completely rodent proof. In particular, you may have seen some of the types that are tumbling compost bins. They look like a round barrel that's off the ground on a stand, and they turn like this. Those one, oh, sorry, you're probably not looking at my face. They turn. I can't use hand motions right now. Those ones are completely rodent proof, not just rodent resistant, because there's no way for them to get in. So that can be something to get right off the bat if you know you're living somewhere or you have something about your situation that might make mice more of a problem. Normally though, all we need to do is keep it wet and stirred and we are golden. Okay. In the wintertime, it's very simple. We can add material, but it's not going to break down until the spring because it freezes. There are some warmer parts of the world where things might stay working through the winter, but not anywhere that it gets down to -20, -30, or -40. It always freezes here. So one thing you may find in the wintertime is that things get kind of full because since they aren't breaking down, they aren't shrinking. Compost materials shrink a lot while they're decomposing. They get to be about a quarter or a third as big as they were when they went in. But of course, this isn't happening in winter. If your compost bin ends up getting quite full in winter, mine always does around this time of year, it's almost brimming full. You can always put out a secondary container, like a big tub or a garbage can with a lid, throw your stuff in there, and then leave it outside so it's still frozen. And in the spring, when things thaw out, it will make a bunch more room and you can just put it on top. Okay, last thing. When is it done? It is done when it looks brown or dark brown or black and crumbly. And it should have, this is very important, an earthy smell, no sour smell, no gross food smell, just that smell of damp soil. This picture, I like it a lot because it shows that even though it's crumbly and brown and it'll smell like damp soil, it still doesn't look pristine like the nice compost in a bag that you get from a gardening store. It will have chunks in it. It's going to have little bits of eggshells. It's going to have sticks. It's going to have peach pits. It'll have little chunks of avocado skin. All of the soft stuff will be completely gone, but the hard stuff will often still have little pieces left. This is normally what home compost looks like. It's important to learn how to recognize it because sometimes people are frustrated that it doesn't look like the pictures of stuff from the store. If you want it to look nice and fine and perfect like the stuff from the store, it's very simple. You just need to take this chunky brown stuff, and put it through a screen. So a piece of metal mesh that's an inch or half an inch, the size of the holes. So it's sometimes also called hardware cloth, but metal mesh, you can get it from any hardware store, and just screen it through that into a wheelbarrow. It'll take out all the chunks. They can go back in the compost bin, and what you'll be left with will be very much like the fluffy material that you get from a store, which is also useful if you're wanting to use it in some sort of a fine application, like as part of a potting mix or raked into a lawn, somewhere where chunks would be very noticeable and kind of a problem. Other than that, though, basically, there aren't any really strong rules on how to use it. You just have to get it back into contact with the soil. It can go into a potting mix. It shouldn't be the whole potting mix, but it can be up to half of a potting mix. You can put it on top of soil. You can mix it into soil. You can sprinkle it around your favorite plants, but just anything that gets it back onto or into the dirt is going to work. You don't have to take the chunks out. You can see again in this picture, this compost has lots of little chunks in it, but if you want to, you can always put it through a screen. You can also take maybe half an inch of compost and rake it out into a lawn. It'll look really muddy for a day or two, and then the grass will grow through it, and you'll find that your grass needs less watering and grows more green afterwards. One last thing, and this is if you live in Saskatoon, the city does offer a $20 rebate for people buying compost bins or rain barrels, and you can find it online. There's a website here, but you can also just search Saskatoon Compost Rebate and it will pop right up. Okay, I do not have time to talk about these today, and I knew I would not, but I just wanted to mention, if you're interested in other types of composting, things like composting in a trench or composting in a little vermicompost bin in a house, or even composting in a bokashi bucket, you can reach out to the compost coaches after today and ask for more information on any of these methods. They all work just as well as the bins. They have different specific situations that they're often more convenient for. And I actually do basically all of them because, again, I'm a soil nerd and I can't help myself when it comes to collecting different compost methods. So I've tried everything. It's like collecting hockey cards or something. Yeah, there's many different methods, and some of them are even specifically useful for doing indoors without smells or pest problems. This is the information for the Saskatoon Compost Coaches. We're a community group here in town, and if you live in town, we can do home visits, respecting social distancing, or digital visits. If you live out of town, you can still ask us questions. We'll give you the best answers and help that we can, and we are always happy to talk to people about compost. Thank you so much. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. I realize, I left less time for questions than I meant to, but if there are any burning questions, I would be very happy to answer them.
I would just like to jump in and say thank you, Lisa, for all the information. For me as a new composter, it was very helpful. My husband actually built me a compost bin last year, and I have I'm just looking at the picture here of the drawing that we did. It looks something like this.
Yeah. Okay.
So if you guys are interested, I have the directions on how to build one. And we actually also took advantage of the rebate from the city of Saskatoon, which was quite nice. We bought all the materials at Home Depot, and then we one Saturday afternoon went outside and built it. So that was nice. So I wanted to say thank you again. Thank you also to the Saskatchewan German Council, the Sask Lotteries, and Sask Culture for providing funding to put on events like this. I know I have a few questions, but I'll let everybody else go first. If you guys have questions, you're welcome to type in them in the chat or unmute yourself to ask. And hopefully Lisa will have an answer for us.
I just had a quick question about when you put the compost into your garden. I only have one bin, so it's a mixture of decomposed compost and some that isn't decomposed yet.
Yes.
Is it really important not to get any of the fresh, say, greens into your garden in the spring if you're going to plant seeds? Is there sort of a competition of breakdown and trying to grow seeds in the soil if you get some compostable, non-composted material in your garden?
Gotcha. The good news is no, it's pretty well okay, especially if you're doing it in the spring up to, a couple of weeks or a few weeks before you're planning to put the seeds in. If you're doing it right before, it can still be okay as long as there's not a whole ton of fresh material. It's basically, if your whole compost bin was filled with brand new material, new scraps and everything, then it might be a little bit of an intense environment for any little tiny seedlings that are trying to grow. When plants are only this tall, they're very sensitive and they're not very good at growing in fresh compost. Once plants are bigger, like bedding plants, anything sort of this big or getting bigger and bigger, they don't care at all. It's fine. It doesn't matter if it's fresh or old. But when they're just this big, you got to be a little careful for them. I'm assuming from the question that you might have the type that turns, like a tumbling compost.
No, I just have the wooden kind. Gotcha. And okay. I only empty it every 2 years. So the bottom part is really nicely composted, but the top part isn't. So I take up the wood and then move all the non-composted part away, and then just try and put the composted part into my garden and then put it back and then put all the fresh stuff back in. But often, I get some of the non-composted materials mixed in.
The short answer is a little bit of fresh material is absolutely fine. Okay. A ton of fresh material doesn't work well with little tiny baby seedlings. Great. A ton of fresh material is pretty okay if you're growing plants that are already this tall. So as long as you're trying to separate out the stuff that's composted from the stuff that's brand new, then that will be more than enough. If you are using a tumbling bin that mixes all the new stuff and the old stuff together all the time, then people often find that they need to create some kind of a batch system where they stop adding to it at some point, either by having 2 tumbling compost bins or having a tumbling compost bin and then a place where they dump the tumbling compost bin to finish off.
I would like to have 2 compost bins so that when I finish one, I work on the other, and then I can just empty one at a time every year.
I sympathize with that. And I also say that as somebody who has a problem with collecting too many compost bins, make sure that you have an upper limit on how many you're allowed to have and stick to it, or eventually you'll have no garden, just compost bins.
I'm only sticking with one.
Okay.
Thanks, Lisa.
No problem. Thank you. There's a question in the chat here that was really good. I'm wondering if I can answer it quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody was wondering, does it matter if the bin is in a sunny or a shady spot in the yard? And that's a great question, and I forgot to address it in our talk. So when you're putting your compost bin somewhere in your space, there's a couple of things that are important and a couple of things that aren't. Important things are it needs to be on top of a surface that's like natural and porous so that any extra liquid can sink in. You wouldn't want to put it on asphalt or concrete because it's going to get kind of a slick around it of compost juice, and that's not great. So you want to put it on soil or grass or mulch or something like that. The second thing is that you want it to be somewhere that is convenient to get to, because you want to make it easy to use. So while we sometimes have the instinct to like hide it away in the far corner of the yard behind 6 rows of trees and over 3 snowbanks, that makes it really difficult to get our stuff out to it and to harvest it at the end. So try to find a spot that it's easy to get to and easy to harvest from without a ton of pain on your end. In terms of sun or shade, the good news is that it's not really important. When something is in a really sunny location, it'll warm up faster in the spring, and it may get a little warmer in the summer, which can help it break down faster, but it will also dry out quicker, so it might need more watering. Whereas if it's in a fully shady area, it'll be frozen a little bit longer in the spring, and it might not get as hot in the summer, but it also will probably stay damp a lot better, so it won't need as much watering, and it's just kind of a trade-off. What we tend to say to people is if you've got a nice prime sunny spot, grow plants there. Plants need the sun. The compost can do without it. So yeah.
There were 2 more questions in the chat, Lisa. I don't know.
Okay, yeah. Putting leaves on the garden and digging them in. Yes, that can be a great way to compost. We would often call that sheet composting or sheet mulching, where we're just adding a big flat layer to the whole thing and then kind of mixing it in. It would be possible to add more leaves than is beneficial. If you start noticing that it seems like the leaves aren't breaking down very fast, or that basically if you have more leaves than dirt, then you might throw yourself out of whack. But as long as it's amount of leaves that are still routinely breaking down into the soil really well, and you're still finding that they're gone after a season, then that's just a great way to add in tons of organic matter to the dirt. You can also, and this actually kind of fits into the next question where somebody is asking, what do you do with large amounts of leaves? What I do with large amounts of leaves is I actually really like to mulch with them. Mulch being just putting like a layer of 4 to 6 inches on top of the dirt in between the plants, because I find mulching with something nice and degradable like that, as it breaks down, it just adds nice organic material to the soil. If I'm using something like a rubber mulch or landscape fabric, as it breaks down over time, and it does, it's just adding trash to the soil, basically plastic and other things. But if I'm using something like leaves or straw or wood chips, then it's just adding more organic material. And that mulch does a few things. It makes fewer weeds germinate because they don't have access to the sun. So there's less weeding for me, which I like. And there's also, it helps the soil to not be very compacted. If we're walking on it a lot, it makes a big difference for soil compaction. And the final thing is that it does help the soil to stay moist longer and not dry out so much when it's hot and sunny. So for me, what do I do with large amounts of leaves? I mulch with them. If you had even more leaves, like so many that you couldn't possibly use them, then I would basically try giving them away to other gardeners, other community gardens, or failing that, if there is a large-scale compost drop-off in your area, just taking them there. That's if you have hundreds of bags that you couldn't possibly use. So, I also store up about 10 bags of leaves every fall because I know that I'm going to need them for the following year to balance out my green materials. Somebody has asked in the chat, do you know about industrial composting? Where is it done and how is the created energy being used? So I know some things. Industrial composting varies in size from the very simple stuff like in the city of Saskatoon. We just have some very large outdoor compost piles known as windrows that the city is making so that they have that finished compost out of the landfill and also for city parks. But even larger cities like Toronto and Quebec City and Montreal often have systems that absolutely dwarf anything that we've got out here on the prairies. Actually, Calgary and Edmonton both have some large ones as well. They'll often be in a massive indoor style warehouses, and they'll have specific types of cement pads laid out, and they'll have air pipes, and they'll have turning machines, and they'll have monitors, and they'll basically be doing it very, very scientifically. And very, very fast. And in terms of energy generation, the only ones of those that I've seen is something called an anaerobic digester. So those are the ones that they take the waste and they put it in this huge cylindrical, I don't know, building, silo perhaps is the right word. and they ferment it and they gather the biogas that comes off of it, and then they burn that for electricity. And then at the end, the digestate, which is basically the sludge they get out of the silo at the end, that gets composted and put on someone's field. And I have seen those around Montreal. I don't know if there's any energy generation of that type being done on the prairies. That would be an interesting thing to look into. My knowledge is pretty region specific. It's mostly centered on Saskatoon with a little bit around other parts of Saskatchewan. As far as I know, no one in Saskatchewan is doing anaerobic digesters, but it would sure be cool if we were. Yeah,
that's right. Okay, I have one question. I have a friend, instead of going out to the compost every day or so, she has a bucket in her freezer and she puts everything in the freezer and then eventually takes that out.
That's a great plan.
Okay.
That's a wonderful plan. Yeah, if it's frozen, then it's not getting all gross and stinky, and getting all gross and stinky is the impetus for taking it outside. And in fact, when things get frozen and then thawed out again, it kind of helps them to break down. For anybody who's ever frozen an overripe banana to use in some banana bread later, you know, when you thaw it out, it's not really a banana anymore, it's just some banana sludge. And that's because when things freeze and then thaw out again, it kind of tears up all of the internal cell structure and it makes them much softer. So then they actually break down really fast. So
okay. Sounds good. I might start doing that. I have one last question because I know there's somebody from the Yukon in our meeting and somebody from Ontario.
Okay.
Are there waste reduction councils for other parts of Canada? Do you know? Or
I know there are some, but I'm not sure about Ontario. I know there's the Recycling Council of Alberta that does very similar things to the Waste Reduction Council in Saskatchewan. And for the others, I would have to look into it and get back to you. That's embarrassing that I don't know. I should find out. Sorry.
That's okay.
What kind of Canadian am I? Okay, so I will have to look into that. And in the meantime, I guess I would encourage you to look into it as well. Sometimes even if you can't find a waste reduction council, look into a recycling association or something like that, because they often do a variety of things beyond recycling as well. I also see 2 quick questions in the chat, which I can answer real quick if it's okay. I know we're over time and I apologize for that. One is, how long does it take in general before you can get your finished product approximately? And so the answer there is, under ideal conditions, as little as like 2 months, but more commonly about 3 or 4 or 5 months. So what that means, actually more like 3 or 4 months. It doesn't really need to be 5 months. So basically you should be able to, it is common to be able to harvest some finished compost at least once a year. If you're really on top of things, you might be able to do it twice a year, once in the spring and once in the fall. It's also very common for people to get into a rhythm where they do it in the spring or they do it in the fall, because that allows them to add the finished compost to the garden without having to worry about the plants that are currently growing there. So they do it before they plant or after the plants are done. And also, just to keep in mind what I mentioned briefly in my presentation, that finished compost is smaller than what went into it. So when you're harvesting your compost, you might be surprised to find out all of this pile of compost that I put in has made me this much finished compost, which is, it's a tragedy, but oh well. Yeah, so the amount you get out of it might be smaller than what you expect. But it is very powerful stuff, so it is still 100% worthwhile. Last thing here that I see is, are orange peelings fine? Yes, all citrus is fine, all onions are fine. What other ones have I heard? Rhubarb material is fine, pine cones and pine needles and spruce needles are fine. There's a variety of different types of plant materials that are a little bit rot resistant, which is to say that for the first couple of weeks, it'll look like nothing's happening. And then the enzymes will, the rot-resistant enzymes will give up, they'll be taken over by bacteria, and they'll start breaking down properly. So things like citrus and evergreen trees and stuff like that, sometimes people are worried about putting them in, but it's just, they take a couple of extra weeks, but then they break down fine. Yeah, no problem.